Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm extremely happy to be here with Lucie Rico and Hanna Bervoets. We're here to talk about virtual worlds and uncertainty, but thank you both for being here.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
I mean...
And just so you know, today for this session, I'm going to be speaking in English. Hanna will be speaking in English, and Lucie will be speaking in French. So we'll have a little bit of a multilingual conversation going on. Let me just briefly introduce them. Lucie Rico is a French novelist, screenwriter, and director who also teaches creative writing. Her first book, in French, Le Chant du Poulet sous vide, came out in English as Fowl Eulogies. And we'll be talking about her second book today, GPS, which when it comes out eventually in English, will probably be called GPS. And Hanna Bervoets is a Dutch writer, an essayist and screenwriter of many novels, 7, I believe. And today we're going to be talking about We Had to Remove This Post, which recently came out in English in 2022. And she has another novel coming out in English in 2023 called Ivanow.
No, it's out in France. It's not coming out in English, but it's out now in France. And the original title is Ivanow, and then the French title is Okay, you're all gonna laugh.
L'expérience Hélène. Expérience Helena. Elena. Okay, great. It's really a pleasure to put these two books together and put these two authors into conversation with one another. Both books are taking up the very serious and difficult question of the relationship between our inner lives and our virtual lives in the context of our real relationships with others. So I'm going to begin in a very concrete way. I'd like to ask both of you to just introduce your books. So each of these books follow one woman for a particular period of her life. So can you introduce your characters? We have Tu, or Ariane in GPS, and Kaylee in, I'm going to say the title wrong every time, We Had to Remove This Post. So Lucie?
Yeah, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction and for the invitation. GPS follows Ariane. In fact, you don't know her name for a good part of the book because the book is written in the second person, in the familiar form. Ariane is unemployed. She was writing short news articles, but since she lost her job, for a while she hasn't been able to leave home. The only exception she makes is to go to her friend's engagement party because she's supposed to be her friend's best maid of honor. And to tell her how to get to the party, her friend sends her location via Google Maps so that she can find the location. And everything goes well, except the day after the party, her friend disappears. And the only thing left is the red dot that's still moving around the map, and that leads Ariane to many different places where she and her friend had already been together.
Are part of that too. So we are following her as well as the narrator follows that little red dot.
I just love that idea. You know, sometimes when you hear about someone else's book, you're like, I wish I came up with that. But I can't wait to read that. I hope it gets translated soon. So my book is about commercial content moderators, and for those who don't know, these are the people who work 24/7 all around the world to keep our social media platforms safe and clean. So whenever we as users flag content that is on social media like Instagram or Facebook or even LinkedIn or YouTube, whenever we think something is inappropriate and we flag it, then 50% of the times there will actually be a human being somewhere in the world that has to review it. And it has to decide if that content can stay or has to be removed according to their moderating guidelines. So as you just said, my main character is Kaylee, a young woman in her 20s who needs money. She worked at a call center before. She makes more money as a moderator. And she actually, she likes her job. So you have to imagine, these people see a lot of horrible image. They see like child abuse, animal abuse, racist posts, all of this. But my main character kind of looks at her job as if it was a game. At the end of the day, she gets like a rating, like her employee will tell her how many posts she got right. So that helps her doing this job. And what also helps is that she becomes super close with her co-workers, like real fast. And then she falls in love with another female co-worker. And things are looking bright for her until they don't, without spoiling too much.
Yes, yeah. I'll ask just a little bit, how did you go into the world of content moderation? How did you find the idea for this particular story?
Well, I think it was 2018 when I first read about content moderators. This was an article in a Dutch newspaper about a Dutch content moderator who worked in Berlin for a call center that was hired by Facebook. So this is how it usually works. People are not hired directly by the big companies. They are hired by like call center like undertakers who hire them. And I remember when I started to read this article, so this was kind of like a tell-all article about what happens behind the screen. My initial question was, so what did he see? So what do these people see? And of course, that's quite a sensational approach to the subject matter, but it is often, the frame that is used in mainstream media, whatever they handle this topic. But while I was reading that article, my question kind of shifted from what do these people see to what does that mean? What does that do to their worldview? How does it work, this job? What is it like on that floor? So I did more research. I got really interested in this topic. And then I found all these other really interesting aspects of the job. I was just mentioning these moderator guidelines. So this is like a huge, huge set of guidelines that are provided by, let's say, Facebook, because the book is mostly based on Facebook, but I'm not supposed to say that out loud, and the book is just called The Platform. So these moderator guidelines, they are quite arbitrary. What can stay up, like a very, everybody knows about the female nipple, right? You cannot post female nipples, but then you can post male nipples. So I was very fascinated by that vague commercial sense of morality that's not really based on morality, but it's based on capitalism, of course. Mm-hmm. So that was one thing that really intrigued me. And another thing that intrigued me was how close these co-workers come. They're usually not allowed to talk about their jobs outside their jobs. So they kind of share this job. Sometimes they even share a trauma, because it can be quite traumatizing to view all those images. And then two things I'm always interested in kind of came together. So one is social dynamics. Like all of my work kind of is built around social dynamics. Like, what does it mean to belong? Why do we need to belong? What is community? Why do we need community? And the other is the question of normalcy. What is normal? What is right? What is real? And who gets to decide? And especially that last question, like who gets to decide? Why do we think the way we think? That's like the central question to most of my work. So those topics I was already interested in kind of drew me into the subject matter and made me do more research and found out this super interesting story world.
Well, and the shifting guidelines throughout the book are really interesting, and also how Kaylee perceives what is good, what is bad. The coworkers have a lot of these conversations. Well, would you flag that? Would you flag this? And it's a really interesting reflection on how we perceive social media as well. When we're looking at social media, what is real? What is virtual? And I think the book goes into that a lot.
Yeah, I think there's two ways you can read the book. And they're kind of similar, but still they're different. So one way is to see these moderators, to perceive them as stand-ins for us as social media users. Mm-hmm. So then it would be more about how do we engage with social media, which is, of course, a very, very important topic. But, of course, these moderators, they don't use social media the way we do. We don't see those horrible images. We see different kinds of stuff. So it's not really the same. And there's another way to read the book, and that is to perceive these content moderators, to see them as stand-ins for us as citizens, because we are constantly bombarded by images and narratives, by social media, yes, but also by other news media, our neighbors, our family, our friends. We are constantly navigating through all these different planes of morality, these different planes of reality. And the other day, there was a talk about Ukraine that was yesterday. It was super, super, super interesting. And there was a question from the audience that asked, well, I've seen this documentary on Netflix, and I'm American, and we always get told that it's Americans' fault, that the world is, that the war is going on, and what do you think? And that was like a beautiful example of how all of us are constantly like navigating these different realities and trying to find out, what is true, what is real, what do I believe? And sometimes there's not one truth, there's a lot of truths. And that's how I like to look at the book, that it's just about us as citizens, and that you can kind of think about the question, aren't we all content moderators all the time? So that's another way to look at that.
I want to circle back a little bit to GPS on this idea of work, because we had to remove this post. Kaylee gets a real sense of herself and a belonging to this group of people. And this is a central question in GPS as well, because when we finally meet the narrator, she has been, I think, 2 years without work. And can you talk about that? I mean, can you talk about what has happened to her sense of self in the fact that she hasn't been able to work for 2 years?
Oui, je crois que c'était l'idée de départ du livre. Je voulais parler du chômage.
Yes, at the outset I wanted to talk about unemployment because I grew up in a world where unemployment was a big issue, uncertainty in general. And since I liked literature, I was pretty sure that I wouldn't have a job when I grew up, and I found that terrifying. It was as if I wasn't going to have a place in the world because I didn't have a job. So I really grew up with this thought in mind. And the starting point of the book was to adapt Rear Window by Hitchcock, the guy who has a broken leg looking out the back window and imagining all sorts of things about what his neighbors are doing. And I thought, maybe unemployment is a social handicap that is a filter between yourself and the world. It's a way of avoiding the world. And this is how I conceived GPS, with unemployment as a filter that keeps you from taking your place in the world. And my character, as you know, I address her in the familiar form, the second person. So it's a filter between ourself and reality. Perhaps I could say something about the GPS as well, but on the topic of work, I would say that unemployment is a filter that keeps you away from the world.
On that same question, because then we watch her as she follows her friend Sandrine, and it is like she's able to be herself again, because she starts investigating or she starts creating ideas of what maybe has happened.
Oui, complètement. En fait, elle est journaliste de faits divers. Et ça, c'était quelque chose qui m'intéressait aussi, c'est de la mettre...
Yes, she writes short news subjects, and her subjects are always sensationalistic, dog bites man stories, and we realize that at family dinners, that people talk about this. Did you see what happened in such and such a place? It's the same narrative structure as fiction. So there's a tension between fiction and reality that I'm interested in. Somebody who's writing this kind of journalism all day, and this is an actual job. What is their standpoint with respect to the world? How do they see the world? That's why your book interested me as well. What does this relationship with fiction do to us when we see images that we don't know whether they're real or not? I think this is, of course, the other central point in my book is the GPS, the little red dot. We think the GPS is driving the novel, not sure. But what's interesting about the GPS is that before we had GPS, we had to hold a map in our hands, and we followed the path. The GPS puts us at the center of the world. Everyone is looking to see where we are, and that's a radical change in the way of seeing the world. It's as if the world was at our service, and we move and we make the world move. So that was the paradigm shift for me, and that's why I wanted to change the viewpoint on this new way of using the world.
Many lovely connections between the two books, this idea of fake and real, and also this of point of view and perspective. I'm going to ask you both to talk about a little bit of the technical aspects of the book. So the choice to write in the second person, and then also there's a frame around your novel that Kaylee is actually speaking to someone. So there's also there's another layer of how the story is being told. Can I ask you to talk about that?
Yes, so in the beginning of the book, we learned that there's a lawsuit that was filed by some of Kaylee's ex or former co-workers. So she gets these calls from a lawyer called Mr. Stitik, and he wants her to join that lawsuit. But Kaylee has a secret that, makes her not so much want to join that lawsuit. But he keeps calling her, and he keeps sending her messages. And then in the beginning of the book, she starts talking to him. She's saying "Hi, Mr. Stitik. Please stop calling. I will not participate in your lawsuit, and this is why." And then she starts telling her story, and then without giving too much away, we kind of start to learn that she may or may not be an unreliable narrator. And in the end, we do learn her secret. Yeah. And I think, for me, I always like to tell my books, I always like to start in the present. It's a cheap trick. In Dutch, I'm not sure if it's the same in English and French, but in Dutch we say that's a window structure. You start in the present. It's the oldest trick. Frankenstein, a lot of people don't know this, but Frankenstein is actually, it's told by this guy in the present, and he goes back then there was Frankenstein. I'm thinking about Frankenstein because we're near Geneva. So it's a very old trick, but I do love it, because you can build tension. Yeah. Your main character knows something that you as a reader do not know, and you kind of feel they may tell. So it draws you into the narrative, and that's why I like to use that.
And there's a little bit of a confessional aspect
to
it, which is it creates a lot of tension, because we slowly start to realize that Kaylee is uncertain. Kaylee, although she presents herself as very certain, again, she's one of the only people in among her group of friends who doesn't seem to be having too much trouble with all of this really difficult and violent material that they're often looking at. She seems fine, and then we slowly realize that maybe it is affecting her in a similar way. And then in GPS, I want to call it confessional as well, because although the narrator is, it's really tricky because she is speaking to the reader. You can't help it with a book written in the second person. She is speaking to the reader. And yet it is about herself, and she's telling a story, and we're getting into her brain, and there is a sort of a confession going on for her as well. There wasn't a question in there. That was unfairly no question.
Non, mais c'est aussi tricky pour moi parce que c'est vrai.
Yes.
En fait, j'ai construit tellement ce trouble sur le fait de ne pas savoir qui
I based
parle à qui,
everything on the fact that we didn't know who was talking to whom.
C'est la narratrice.
She is the narrator, but at the same time, she isn't really the narrator.
Et oui, la narratrice non fiable, c'est quelque chose aussi.
The unreliable narrator is a device that I like a lot. It's a good way of talking about how you see fiction and where the boundary between fiction and reality is. And I started writing the book in the first person, but there was something about it that didn't work, because I was talking about voyeurism and looking at these images, and about Rear Window, the Hitchcock film. So a window shows some things, reveals some things, and hides others. But in the first person, it didn't allow me to convey the fact that, yes, some things are hidden, but also the telephone controls us. We're voyeurs, but we're also seen by the algorithms, by the interfaces, and on the map. Google Maps is a political representation of the world. It's not the real world. It's not. We give all our trust and faith in Google Maps, and people end up falling off cliffs because the GPS says go straight ahead. This happened to me, not a cliff, but I have no sense of direction, and I know how to get home. But if I follow the GPS, I'm going to make a huge detour. So there's something that's contradictory to the world. I wanted to say something about this. And the other, I think there's a loss, also a loss of reference points. It's a trompe-l'œil novel. Is the telephone talking to Ariane? Is Ariane talking to herself? Is Ariane talking to the reader? Or is Sandrine, who has actually disappeared and has become a red dot, is she talking to her friend, Ariane? So I tried to build the book so that all these hypotheses could be true and not give anything away. I hope it holds up. I hope it works. It's what we're wanting to find out is what happened to Sandrine, and Ariane is the one who's investigating. But all the possibilities, all the options are open.
I want to change a tiny little bit the conversation because we touched on this idea of contemporary. It's very contemporary, both of your stories, and the majority of the books we've been talking about this weekend have actually been about history. It's been historical fiction and historical narratives and questions of memory. And as I was preparing for this session, it really struck me that both books are about these online spaces that create enormous amounts of documentation. I mean, just the content moderation alone, I cannot conceive of the amount of information that is going on. And in GPS, again, there's the mapping and the faits divers and the Google Maps and the photographs and just, right, it's all there. These are immense archives of human lives, and they're not filtered. They're really messy. They are really, really, and they're huge, right? So this is a slightly large question, but what role do writers have in working either against that massive archive that is so uncontrolled, or working for it, or working with it? It touches a tiny little bit about what we were speaking earlier, that this book can be seen in some sense as like an anti-internet novel, and yet in a conversation earlier, that's not necessarily your intention.
No, we were talking about this backstage. You know, when you write about tech, people often think your books are about tech. But actually, for me, they are about human beings in a modern world. So often when you introduce either social media or just the internet, which has become so normal by now, I mean, we've had it for more than 20 years, still some reviewers or readers will think, oh, you're saying something about the internet. And often they think you're saying something negative, because why would you say something positive about the internet? You know, but for me, it feels very logical that when I write a contemporary novel, that tech is there. And of course, it's a little different with this book, you know, because it's about tech workers or it's about digital hidden labor, but it's also about labor. So sometimes there were reviewers in the Netherlands that thought that this was like an anti-social media book. Offended is not the right word, but it got me sad because, like I said, for me it's about so much more. And what interested me in this moderators was that they were negotiating moralities also, not just realities like I was just talking about, but also moralities, because on one hand they have the guidelines, then they have their own morality, the way they were raised, the country they were brought up in. And then there's this group morality, like these social media workers, they form their own little rules and their own little things and jokes and stuff like that. And for me, that was what the book was about. But a lot of people thought, oh, so they're seeing horrible images and you must hate social media. In fact, I love the internet. You know, I think that's one of the best inventions of humankind. There's a lot of reasons to hate social media. Because the way it is structured, because the tech companies that own it, there's a lot that's rotten about it. That's not in the book, but I know it's out there. And I must say, that's right, that's true. But there was also so many beautiful things, you know, about, I mean, I don't want to sound about like Elon Musk or anything, but, you know, especially like for marginalized groups or, you know, all these people that got to, well, no, I'm not going to say why it's so great. I'm going to say I think it's also very great. And that book is not meant to be like anti-social media at all.
I like what you said about the hidden digital labor in that sense, because this is something we don't,
yeah.
And this was really interesting to read as you think, you know, when you flag something, there is someone that actually has to look at it then. And so, you know, it is, I'm actually taking my responsibility and giving it to someone else.
Yeah, but you never, well, I didn't. I was just talking about to you about that article from 2018. I also felt like super naive after I had read that I'd never given it a thought that there's real human beings doing this labor. And when we think of like digital labor, we think of computers, we think of artificial intelligence, we think of, you know, chatbots, and they are all there, but there's still thousands and thousands and thousands human beings, not just working as a content moderator, but also, for example, Google Books. Sometimes you like Google something and you get a Google hit, and that would be like a book, and you can go through the PDF of the book. Those books were scanned by human beings, page for page. And there's actually this really cool art project by an artist who was looking for human traces in Google Books. So she found like these pages that had like hairs on them, or like fingerprints, or like a part of like a hand or something like that, to make visible this, you know, invisible digital labor. And when we think about invisible labor, we often think about like the sweatshops and like the people that put together our cell phones. But you know, there's just as many people working in invisible digital. It's hard to say it in English, but you know what I mean. There's lots of people working there, and it fascinated me. And I don't want to like say, oh, that's bad and that needs to change. I mean, content moderator, it's like someone has to do it. The working circumstances definitely need to change, but I'm not just, this book is not saying, oh, we should ban this. I mean, yeah, it has to happen.
I feel like that article about someone looking up for human hair, that is something that Ariane would have written that article. Yeah. That would have been really interesting for her. Yeah, because, please, no, go on. That's the kind of thing she's quite interested in. So there's a part in the book where she does actually get some work. And she has I would say she starts having a very complicated relationship with that work that she's actually doing. I'd have to say, both books are difficult to speak about without giving away anything about the ending. So I'm being very careful in talking about the actual stories, because I can't go past a certain point without giving too much away. I want to talk about, in both books, each woman has a very serious relationship with another woman, and that's central to the story. So I'd like to begin essentially with Ariane and Sandrine, because they are, in both books, the women are negotiating their relationship with the other woman through the virtual world and through the real world. And so in particular with Ariane and Sandrine, they are having a very deep relationship, and the reader is going back through their deep relationship. But in fact, they are separated. They're having a virtual relationship. Can you talk about how that, why you wanted to write it that way, or how it worked for that particular relationship?
Oui. Alors moi aussi.
Yes.
Non, mais j'aime beaucoup.
I also really like what you said. It's not a novel about the internet. It's really a novel that takes as a starting point the way you can find reference points in the world, the way you establish relationship with others. It's a book about a very strong relationship, a teenage relationship. I'm also trying not to spoil the end of the novel, and I think the part that I can tell about ends very fast in the book, but it's really a novel about friendship. It's called GPS, but it's a novel about time. But I do think GPS has to do with time. We navigate in a space that no longer exists. Google Maps trucks navigate the streets 6 to 12 months before the moment in time when you use it. So
it's there in the memory. I say so in the book. If a nuclear bomb hits a place, well, and destroys the place, it'll still exist in Google Maps for at least 6 to 12 months. So it's a magical tool, and there's time lapse that helps you navigate through a place the way it was 10 years before, 20 years before, to look at the effect of climate change. You didn't ask about climate change, but you asked about the archive. And yes, this is something that I'm interested in. I'm interested in looking at this present place, this thing that we use to navigate on a daily basis in our modern-day lives, which we think is a geographic tool. It's also a memory tool, and it's a sentimental tool. These places are sentimental, and this is the dimension that I'm interested in. I looked at how it can document friendship, long-standing friendship, because Ariane and Sandrine met online. There are lots of online traces of them. So it's also about the traces that are left on the internet, which are very tangible traces that can be reanalyzed even once the people have disappeared. So they've met online, they like the same rock band, and instead of talking, they share lyrics to songs, which they think is a lot more spiritual than anything else. So it's what they imagine about the other and how they use fiction for this. And very often I was also told that my novel was against the internet because it does challenge the internet, the way we use the internet. But I think the internet is just like fiction. It's dangerous if you dive into the internet without challenging it, without challenging the media that gives you access to the story that's told. And I think that's exactly what's happening in this fiction.
You've said it so beautifully, but these traces, these remaining elements of Sandrine, in this moment where her friend is looking for her, they become more and more important as Ariane follows her, as the narrator follows her, as we follow her. So there's all these different layers, which I think is very appropriate as well to any discussion about the internet. And there's a notion of responsibility in both. At a certain moment, the reader starts saying, like, go out of the house, like, you know, and stop following her only on the phone. And so I wonder about that. Like, how can we find our responsibility in terms of the internet? I mean, the question is really strong, and we had to remove this post because she is literally responsible for what people will see online. So how do we even know what questions we should be asking about this technology? How do we do that? That's a huge question.
Yes.
Yes. It's also linked to the first question that you asked about unemployment. How can you be disconnected from the world? Her best friend disappears. She sees it in her pocket as a red dot on a screen, and she's so fascinated by her that she has a hard time getting out of her home. I also thought it's crazy. She stays in her room. She doesn't go out. It gets on my nerves. At one point you say, well, if you think she's in danger, why don't you get out of your room to help her? And I think the answer is to find in her relationship to her boyfriend, Antoine, who's a fireman, whom she doesn't care about because he lives so much in the real world that she has a hard time establishing a relationship with him. I'm not quite answering your question, but you asked, she does find a job, she becomes a journalist, but instead of writing about miscellaneous news items the way they are, she finds them boring, so she starts inventing news items. And she thinks, well, is it important if I invent them? They might become real in the internet space. And the entire book confuses what you think is right, true, wrong, and that's what I thought was brilliant in your book, because you no longer know what's real and not. I do hope my readers can find clues about what is real and not, but Ariane, my narrator, is lost. Ariane, the name comes from the Greek mythology. She gets lost between reality and fiction. And I do think that through unemployment, through the extended use of the internet or fiction, if you're a novelist, you can confuse fiction and reality in a sense, because it's also a metaphor for writing. She's alone at home and she's writing books, and she loses all sense of reality and she gets lost.
Now, both books are talking about very serious situations. They are. So this question is slightly difficult because I don't want to give the impression that either one are actually funny, but they are funny. And I'm really curious how, when you were writing it, or even in terms of how it was received, how you negotiated that. There's a notion of a very almost dark absurdity to what is happening in both stories. Did that come naturally to the story? Is that part of your world, your sensitivity to the world? But there's really serious subjects going on in these books, and yet there's humor.
Yeah, I think with me it came with the narrator. So the narrator is a 28-year-old queer woman, and she's kind of childish in some way. So she's leading an adult life, she has a job, she has a girlfriend eventually, she has a house, but her mother died when she was still a teenager. And like my best friend, her mother died when she was a teenager. And she told me once that it felt like she was kind of frozen at the age her mother died. And of course, this is not for everybody who like lost a parent, but I remember that. I kept that in my head while I was writing this story. Because in a lot of ways, Kaylee is not that mature. Also, she's a queer woman. I am a queer woman myself. And I know that a lot of queer persons feel like they kind of skipped their teenage years because they weren't out yet. So they weren't able to develop in ways that straight people do. So that's another thing that sometimes add with some queer people, with my main character, and also with me sometimes, I feel, to like a Peter Pan syndrome, a Peter Pan life. So that makes her, sometimes, you know, when I was writing her voice, I thought of myself as a teenager. She can like be very stubborn, she can be quite childish, but that's what also makes her funny. And she can kind of be very strict, like, oh, it's not like that in the book, but she can be like, oh, that was such a loser, da. And that makes the book, I think, a little playful, more playful than maybe it would have been if the narrator was more serious. And I think the subject matter really needs that, needs a character like that. And I always love characters like that, so that's also why she's there. But I think that really, like her voice, her tone of voice really helps. And then you kind of, again, without giving too much away. So she's in a relationship with another woman who's a little older, and their coping mechanisms differ. They really, really differ. Like she's in a relationship with Secret, who has the same, her name is Secret, and she has the same job, and she wants to talk about stuff. But Kaylee has never learned how to talk about, you know, these heavy emotions. She's never been able to do so. And then that doesn't work in their relationship. That's not spoiling anything. That doesn't really work. But that's kind of the flip side of, you know, her character. She's funny and she's stubborn, and that's fun to read, but there's a flip side to that. There's another side to that. And in the end, she's also a very tragic character in that way.
And it feels very real in a sense. I mean, I think the reader has a lot of empathy for Kaylee, who doesn't want to go into these dark subjects. So, you know, it feels almost comforting for us that Kaylee can take some of them not very seriously. And, you know, the racist joke or the whatever, you know, the friends can stand around in the beginning and do that. And it removes a bit of the stress for the reader as well.
She seems very sensible too. And I hope lovable. I mean, there's kind of a divide between readers, I think. Like some readers totally get her. I would say they get her when they like her. And some readers are like, wow, we don't get this narrative. She feels so unattached. But for me, she's a very caring, loving person who just doesn't know how to show her feelings properly.
Yeah, and as the story develops, and as we see that she isn't coping as well as she thinks that she's coping, that sort of distance starts to make more sense.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. That was I meant to do that.
Yeah, and how about the humor for Ariane?
Je pense que j'ai un humour.
I think I've got a very deadpan sense of humor. I've written 2 novels. Fowl Eulogies, a woman who wants to pay tribute to a chicken by writing their eulogies on the packing. So I do think I've got quite a great sense of humor to diffuse a certain tension, and humor helps to show things. Very often my topics are contemporary topics, and it helps take a step back, just like unemployment. It helps show people's daily lives. I like to take these things as my topic, but it's hard to find the right distance, and I think that my sense of humor helps me do that. It's something that I've thought about a lot since the publication of my novel, because people don't necessarily read it the same way. Some people think it's very funny, and who don't think it's dramatic at all, and then there are other readers who think it's absolutely dramatic. It's not funny at all. They don't see the sense of humor, and then there are everybody in between. So it sort of depends on where you stand, where you place your trust. Some people just follow the red dot. To me, it's a closed ending, whereas for some people, the ending is open. I think it all depends whether you follow the technology, whether you place your trust in the technology and the red dot, which is also another character in the novel, or whether you trust this very unreliable narrator who suffers from depression, who's got all sorts of problems in her life. So it really depends on where your empathy is, and this influences the interpretation of the ending. The sense of humor perceived is not the same depending on that. So for each reader sees the sense of humor in a different way, and readers see things that are absolutely fascinating from an author's point of view. So I don't exactly know where they stand.
I think I'm going to have to open up for questions in a moment, but I want to ask one more thing, just changing track a tiny little bit. We've spoken about your books. You have written and you both do write for film and for television. And I'm curious how you compartmentalize your work and how much writing for the screen, writing for television influences your writing of novels, or vice versa, or how you do that.
Yeah, I used to always I want to be focused on one thing. So I was either doing screenwriting or essays or a column. I used to be a columnist as well. And then, or I would be doing a novel. And that was super hard work. I was always working, and that was okay in my 20s. But when I became a little older, I'm 39 now, I was able to, financially also, to just focus on novels, and I like it better. I also like the craft of screenwriting, because for me, I wonder what it's like for you, but for me, it's just writing a novel without all the hard parts, it's just dialogue, so yay. But what I do not like about it, there's so many people involved, there's a director, and there might be a television channel, and someone a sponsor, and so many people who have a say in that. And in the Netherlands, 80% of the television projects will not be made in the end. So there will be a script and there will be a development project. And then after 2 years, the channel will say, no, we're not going to do that. So I got very tired of that. And what I love about just being a novelist and focus on novels is that I get to decide everything. And I know when it will come out, and I'm a control freak. So I think that's better for me and everybody around me. Yeah.
How about you, Lucie?
Je suis assez d'accord, c'est assez aliénant.
Yeah, I agree. It's totally alienating to have to deal with all the comments from other people during the creative process. It's much easier when you're alone writing a novel. But I like the group dimension, but when you have to take notes, it's no fun. But I think I need it because a novel is really being immersed in fiction. You're worried that you might fall into it like a hole. And I think I like to use the outside world to feed into my fiction. So I like to have lots of different projects at the same time. And in fact, I often write on my telephone. I send emails to myself. So I work in little fragments so that I don't feel like I'm in a tunnel writing for just one purpose. So I like to scatter my attention and energy as much as possible. So I need that whole range of work projects. I've asked to work on a play with choreography, but I do prefer writing books. That's what's at the heart, that's my core business, as it were, and the rest of it feeds my imagination.
I'd like to open it up for questions. Do we have any questions in the room? I have more as well. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really interesting. There's a philosopher called Honora O'Neill who talks about the waves of communication technology that hit the world, and you know, the ancient Greeks were suspicious of things that were written down because they believed in, you know, speaking, and then, you know, we had printing technology, which kind of, you know, connected to the Reformation in Europe and so on, but society adapts, and you get footnotes and libel laws, and, you know, and her point is that we're sort of in the middle of that with the internet, and we're in the process of adapting to it. But I kind of wonder, are we getting better at this? I mean, you kind of think of the, you know, despite your comments, Hanna, about the positive side of the internet, you know, there's the mental health, and there's, you know, the kind of marketization of dating, and, you know, the kind of, all the other things that we see. Are we getting better at this?
You know, I think with all questions that are about the internet kind of morally, the answer is always yes and no. It's always like both. Are we getting better at it? I don't know, things are going super fast, of course, especially with artificial intelligence, with the chat, you know, the chat bots and those developments. When I worry about those, because I do worry about those sometimes, I comfort myself with that thought, you know, like we're always adjusting, it's always a process. When the spelling check was introduced, people were actually, some people, especially teachers, thought that was just the end of it. You know, like some teachers right now with the chatbots are saying, well, that's the end of it. So I hope that will just be a tool that help us to perform, well, not better, because we don't need to perform better. We don't need to have this capitalist idea of growth, but, you know, help us to perform. But you know what? I don't know. I don't know where it will go. I do believe, I'm not a technophobe, so I do believe that technology will help us in many ways. Think about, you know, only the medical world in itself, and with climate change, we will need technology, but are we getting better at it? I don't know, like cell phone addiction, that's a really, really real problem. I go to schools often to talk about my work, and every teacher tells me that these kids, they do not only read less, they find reading really hard. And of course, that is a major problem. You know, 50% of the Dutch kids between 12 and 15 or something like that, 50% of them are not able to read like a full page and fully grasp what it says, only that. So that is a major problem. But the answer is always yes and no, you know. We don't know where it's going to go. We cannot stop it. So let's just see and pray and make the best of it, you know. What do you think?
Yes, I completely agree, and so I don't really know what to say. As a novelist, thinking about a subject, writing a work of fiction and using the technical terminology of internet in your book is the only way, it's the only way I've found, in any case. I think Perec said, if we don't think about things in our daily lives, it's like we're sleepwalking. And I think that's why my book is called GPS. It's a bit of a provocation. All of this terminology, this jargon that we use in our daily lives now, if we set it aside, it's like we're sleepwalking. But in terms of the moral side, I mean, I'm not a specialist on the internet. I'm a consumer of internet like everybody, with Google Maps, but also social networks, social media. And my reaction was to write a novel and try to transform it in poetic terms into poetic terms and get a certain perspective on it. Because yes, it is a problem, but it's not a problem that you can just reject. It's a problem that requires thought.
It's interesting because both books play with that idea of language, of recreating language. I mean, the content moderators speak almost a language of themselves that the reader has to start to understand how they're qualifying these different things. And most definitely in GPS, as we're following her, I mean, she's completely immersed in the language of maps and localization and where she is and her perspective and that perspective and this red dot that she's following around. It becomes like a topographical language that she has to follow and create. So it's really interesting. Any other question? Please.
I can't help remembering that Jonathan Coe came here a few years ago, and his book, which was made into a film, has a character that falls in love with his GPS. He develops an intimate relationship with his sat-nav. I haven't yet read your book, but all these technologies that you talk about in your books are isolating. And there's an element of solitude, being in society, thinking we're communicating with others through social media, but in actual fact, a lot of people are very much alone. Is there an element of that in your book? Well, I saw the film, but I prevented myself from leaving the book or reading the book because I thought if I read a book about a GPS while I'm writing a book about GPS, it's not going to work. So now that I finished the book, maybe I can read the book. Yes, my book talks about solitude, and paradoxically, also, there's a missing dimension in GPS. GPS is in two dimensions. The third dimension is the sentimental dimension. She's looking something in the temporal plane. She's putting all of her friendship with Sandrine into the GPS, but the sentimental layer is missing. So I don't think the book is cold. It's about how much love you can give to a red dot. It's a new relationship. And I thought it was important to allow that new relationship to build up, because things happen on interfaces when you communicate by WhatsApp, text messages, video conferences. Messages get conveyed, relationships spring up. What we take from these is not necessarily less true or real than our real life relationships. It's just that certain things can't be exchanged necessarily. When you meet somebody online and you chat with them, is there anything you talk about that you couldn't talk about in real life? And in what way is that relationship different from a relationship with someone you're seeing physically? The difference between Ariane and Sandrine allows her to see the reality of their real life relationship, and she learns something about her friend that she wasn't able to see before. So this paradox was important for me. She's elsewhere, she's lost, she's losing her mind in a certain way, but in the same way she's learning something. At the same time she's learning something about her friendship with Sandrine.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, that, at least I think what you said, that, online relationships, they're different. I mean, the language is different. A lot of things are different, but they don't necessarily have to be less worthy or less profound. I mean, I think that's kind of a cliche to say, oh, we only talk to each other by phone now. It's not like in another world we would sitting next to each other all the time. I mean, there's friends that I never see, but, because we chat, I kind of know what's going on in their lives. And then, for instance, with my girlfriend, we don't live together, but we send each other like memes and funny stuff and also just practical stuff like all day. And that's a way of showing love. She shows me a dumb TikTok of Taylor Swift. We both love Taylor Swift. And then she'll just send me a Taylor Swift TikTok. And I know she's thinking about me. And that's also a way of communicating. And that's a way of communicating I'm very, very interested in as a writer, because it's such an important way. We think it doesn't mean anything, but it means lots of things. It means a lot, I think. So and also I think it's important to distinct between relationships to chat box. There's a lot of fiction about falling in love with robots, falling in love with AI. There's a lot of fiction about that. And that's a thought experiment about a relationship where you only give love and don't receive love. And there's a beautiful aspect in that, you know, because you're still loving. And also there's a problematic aspect in that, you could say, because it's lonely. And then on the other hand, when you can communicate with other people on the internet, I think that could be very profound. It can be problematic, again, when you're just shouting on Facebook. That also means something, and I'm interested in that because it means something, but it can be problematic, yes. But when you communicate with people that you already know or people that you don't know, you know, I met friends through the internet. That is not less worthy to me. That does not make us lonely people. When it comes instead of meeting people, then maybe yes, you know, with the pandemic we were all in the little Zoom rooms. That was different, right? Zooming with people, that was different. We don't want to go back to that. And then we felt what it really meant to just be totally reliant on internet communication, and that's not enough, I think. But, you know, when it's in addition to human relationships, I think it can be very profound and very worthy, yeah, and important too.
Do we have another question? I can't see. Yes.
I just want to come back to the question of labor, because you started with mentioning these guidelines from Facebook. Male nipple is allowed, female nipple is not. It really reminds me of Hays Code and the beginnings of Hollywood, and coming back about 60 years. So do you think it's really something new, or is it just something in new disguise, and this is saying more about humanity, capitalism, especially American version of capitalism, with this very, I would say, neat and a bit prude way of looking at human beings?
Well, I am just super, super fascinated by these guidelines, because I'm always interested, like I said, in that question of normalcy. What do we think is normal? But these guidelines are like based on a Western kind of Christian idea of what is right, you know, and they change all the time, you know. So one day, so for instance, we had this super problematic figure in the Netherlands called Black Pete, and he was like Santa's little helper, but it was a black guy. So there were more and more people protesting that, saying that refers to slavery, and please can we stop using that image. But Facebook said it was okay because it was folklore. And then after years and years of protest and flagging, the guidelines changed on that. So they keep changing. And for me, that is such an interesting process, because the people who make the guidelines, and they're not just 5 people, you know, this is a whole process, and there's boards and there's meeting. For them, they don't want to do what they think is right. For them, it's not about morality. For them, it's about what the investors might think will work, and it's about not losing profit and not losing people. So what comes out of that is these Frankensteinish guidelines that definitely tell us something about the world we live in now, because it changes when people say, well, this is racist and we won't want that anymore. So it does kind of reflect our modern ideas about what is right and what is wrong. And then again, it doesn't. And it asks all these super interesting questions. Like for instance, so I forgot to tell that when a moderator removes something, they also need to tell why they're removing it. They need to categorize it. So when you see a video of a guy blowing himself up in a kindergarten space, is that child abuse or is that terrorism? Why are you like? And those questions, they're just endlessly fascinating to me. So that's another thing that really drew me in. And you were comparing it to the Hays Code. Yeah, I think that is comparable, because that code was also very much grounded in, for people that don't know it, like back in the day, when was it, like the 30s, the 40s, I think, was it right after the war? I don't know, but people weren't allowed to have sex on screen, and of course queer people weren't even allowed to hold hands on screen. So they found this, filmmakers found this way to kind of work around that, so when people would like look at a pillow or something like that, that would mean they're having sex. But that code was also like based on this very vague Western Christian commercial idea of what was right, but also reflecting the political issues that were going on at the time. So I think guidelines are always very interesting to look at, like who makes them, what do they say, what do they reflect, and what don't they show? So yeah, that's a good question.
Any more? We have time for one last one. I will ask one last question to sort of finish us off. I would love to know how this book that we were talking about today, how does it fit into what you see your larger body of work? Lucie, do you prefer?
In the books that I'm going to write?
Working on now, one that you're working on now, or GPS, how would you like it to fit into your larger work?
Well, it's my second novel, and I think my second novel was the hardest to write. I don't know why. I think it might always be the case with second novels. They always come after a first novel, which gives a tone. And to me, GPS was the beginning of a trilogy about screens, about the relationship to screens, the real world, the virtual world. The next novel will have to do with video games, and the third novel on movies, horror movies, in the broad sense of the term. So yes, I don't really know. To me, it was a milestone, maybe because it was a second novel and it was announcing something broader. When I finished GPS, I wanted to continue with a second-person narrator, and I wanted to continue thinking about screens. So it was a maze opening up for me, in a sense. It wasn't an end in and of itself.
How about you?
Yeah, for me, I think all of my work is about how culture and also politics and social dynamic shape the way we view the world. So it's always about, like I said, the question, what do we think is normal, and especially why do we think that? And then there's all these factors, of course. But culture is an important factor, and that's, I think most of my novels, maybe all my novels, kind of circle around that question. But the funny thing is, like, a lot of novels I did before are speculative. They have like a sci-fi element to it. I will say that they're like grounded sci-fi. They're quite realistic, but they have like a sci-fi element. And this book is a break from that, because it's almost like, it's very realistic. It's almost documentary. But people, after they read it, they thought it was sci-fi, because they didn't know about content moderators, and they know of me as a sci-fi writer. So that's why I decided also to add like this long list of sources in the end of the book that refer to all the articles I used doing my research, that this is very, very real. So this book is a break from the things I did, in the sense that it's way more realist, but it's got all the topics that my other books also got. So yeah, I think it's very me. People have been telling me it's very me.
It's you.
So, yeah, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. That was really, really interesting, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Merci.